Welcome to Vashon Island and Mukai Farm and Garden. We're located in the center of Vashon Island, a short ferry ride from Seattle and Tacoma in Washington State. That 15-minute ferry ride keeps Vashon rural and lightly populated now, but in the late 19th and early 20th century, when waterways were the main means of transportation, Vashon's central location in Puget Sound was the driver of a pretty vibrant local economy centered on agriculture and shipbuilding. It was during the later part of that boom, starting in the 1920s, that Japanese immigrant B.D. Mukai established a successful strawberry farm in this location, and his wife Kuni began to recreate a piece of her Japanese heritage. B.D. chose to build a typical rural American farmhouse. It was completed in 1927. But Kuni wanted to keep some of her Japanese heritage and traditions. She broke with Japanese patriarchal traditions and designed a Japanese garden of her own, creating the only known Japanese garden in America designed by an immigrant woman.
It's very unusual for a woman to have even been allowed to know very much about Japanese gardening, and she was able to obtain materials from Japan, studied them, learned what the rules are of Japanese gardening and the themes and ideas that go into the designs, and was able to create a small but very intricate Japanese stroll garden. The husband, B.D. Mukai, is very significant in his own right. He created and developed the largest strawberry distribution service at the time during the 1920s and 30s. So he was incredibly successful. And his wife was not out picking strawberries as most farm wives were doing. She was dreaming of a Japanese garden, and she made that dream come true, and he supported that dream. The house is showing signs of deterioration. Some are quite obvious. You can see that the roof has been covered with plastic. Over the years, plants have died. Some of the hardier things have survived. There's one last surviving cherry tree that was planted by the Mukais, and that was something the property was quite well known for.
A group of islanders started a new organization called Friends of Mukai, and that's the organization that has a garden committee and a home committee, and we're working to set up a business plan, and we want to be ready to help do whatever we can to save the property.
There hasn't been the kind of restoration that one would expect to find. There are still people on the island that remember things about this garden, and we're hoping that we'll be able to bring it back.
There are a lot of people on the island who care about it, have watched it decline over the last 10, 15 years. Our ultimate goal is to have it be a community resource.
I'm Karen Keast, the landscape architect that worked with the board to facilitate the preservation of the property and the preservation of the gardens. And then we're very fortunate to actually be able to participate in realizing the restoration of the gardens. And that is something that we don't usually get to do, but makes a huge difference. It makes you see that what you aspired to or wondered about what actually was solved. And when we began with the board, they had accomplished much of the master plan process for the preservation of the property. And it was very focused on the architecture of the buildings and the layout. And we came into the team with some different tools. One of the board members' husband flew his newly bought drone over the property, and actually that was probably one of the most helpful pieces because we had no accurate recording of what was on the ground. And we had heard that there was this and that on the ground, and we could look at county aerials from 1936 to 1970s to 1990s to today. But the drone picture was actually very wonderful and revealing of the edges of things. And from our point, I think we joined at a good time because there was a lot of people who had witnessed the garden's decline and were worried that they needed to really clean it up. But from a landscape point of view, the materials that look like they're not taken care of, or that they're failed or they're died, is actually our only record of what was probably here.
After completion of the preservation plan and the master plan by Karen Keiss, the landscape architect, our facilities committee started to execute the restoration plan of the gardens. And the first piece of that was really approaching the bones of the property and the structure of the garden, which included the circulation system, the utilities, everything underground, the grading, and the pond itself. So the first piece of that we looked at was the circulation system, and we had Karen do a circulation plan for us. And we tried to stay with the original existing conditions as much as we could around the house in terms of the sidewalk and the pedestrian circulation. Concurrently with the sidewalk and the parking and driveway, we did underground utility and grading. Basically everything subterranean, just because the site was a mess. We had everything torn up. So we put all the utilities in, all the drain lines, all the water lines, the electrical lines, telephone lines, all at the same time. We hired a contractor out of Seattle that was is pretty internationally renowned for shotcrete work, and shotcrete is where they spray the concrete on, and they're able to, as opposed to strict forms, they're able to make it more of an amorphous shape. So the pond process itself was interesting to watch. We initially pulled the exterior rocks that were around the outside of the pond, smaller rocks, and we pulled them away, and we cataloged everything. We photographed and cataloged where everything was located. On the mound itself, the large boulders we left in place because they were so large that it would have been cost ineffective to have tried to move anything like that. And then they went in and installed a mechanical system for the pond, which is really like a modern day swimming pool. After the pond was complete, and the sidewalks and the circulation system and everything underground had been completed, then it was time to look at more of a softscape. And at that point, Karen came up with a landscape and irrigation plan for us. Constantly, we were going back and forth when the contractors were here looking at photographs and trying to match that to what we were actually installing and constructing on site.
I believe we couldn't have done anything without a fantastic series of photos that have been taken of the garden. And people record things for a different reason than documentarians. They record them out of love and passion, and also just trying to show progress. And this garden has photos from 1928 through today. And the gardens, you can see how they built the garden, and you can see what the land looked like at that time. And we had a really good eyesight, I think, as an office to look at that. We would gaze fondly at the fact that out the street windows, that used to be 100% an orchard, and everything to the south was strawberry fields in the photos. So the area was incredibly open and expansive. And we traced all the original aerial photos with the photos to produce a map of the evolution of the property over time. And this really helped the design team because it helped recognized that the preservation of this property really needed to focus on this frontage, and that the rear of the property had not been part of the original formal gardens. But probably the most important photos are from parties or gatherings on the porch, on the terrace, overlooking the garden, the north garden.
You know, for BD and Cooney originally to have these big lawns, that was a big deal, you know. As it is today, I think for the same reason, because of the entertaining and the functions that they had and that we have now.
We have so many photos from 1929 and 30 all the way through that we were able to capture each year of what plants went in, how the rocks were installed, and more importantly, from our perspective of preserving the property, was we could understand how much was still here. And it led to my assessment that the stones that made up the north garden, well, actually the rockery, the north rockery, were really the first trial of building the garden. And as people know, the property was raised 4 feet on this side. And instead of putting in a casual rockery, recognizing the amount of effort that went into something like that, the garden boulders were very carefully placed at the apex of the rockery. And that is one of the most beloved sites for the photos, and it also holds the only remaining significant Japanese maple on the property, which is the pride and joy of the property. Other stones actually toppled. You can see the stones that made up the north garden were originally extremely ambitious, so ambitious that they fell over. And are probably covered up with soil. But the plantings went in very early, and they're eclectic. They really show the passion for a garden. I wouldn't say they adhere to a formal approach to the garden, but they're exuberant. And there was always extremely colorful conifers, which were, again, if we're thinking about the period in the early 1930s, very popular in the area. And there's been a lot of focus on the Kubota garden and the nursery. Nurseries in this area were really focusing on the latest cultivars and proud to bring in plants from other areas. So this garden really is extremely diverse in terms of the plantings. What was kind of surprising is how many of the plants are still there. And the most inspiring and challenging plant is probably the yew tree that was on top of the north garden. It had gone from being a wispy little seedling of 4 feet tall and 6 inches wide to being 20 feet wide and 10 feet tall. And so we're very proud that plant is still in the project. There was a lot of debate whether it had outgrown its potential. Anyway, that was our role, is to really epitomize and identify the resources that remain. I know that we couldn't have done it without the photos that were casually taken. The other garden that really sometimes misses that much attention, but the south garden, it's still there. It was built after the north garden. The photos show the north garden complete, and then people erecting stones and settling them. But there was many more photos that were taken there of formal events and people standing on top of the rockery, etc. You notice when the photos are taken that the families are really young and incredibly beautiful and put together, probably for a wedding. And then you see a few years later, which would have been in the middle of the 30s, times are tough, and the couples that are standing on top of the stones are, I believe, the same families, but they've taken a little bit of age and a little more careworn. But The amount of effort to haul the stones, I don't know if it would have been possible if they hadn't had a steady stream of workers that were available to move the boulders. But really it is the boulders that pretty much remain exactly as their original setting that really form the basis for the garden.
A 1933 article about Kuni Mukai's garden marvels at the miniature landscape she had created. Gardens designed by a Japanese woman are rare, on Vashon and Japan. Without Kuni Mukai to describe how she designed her garden, we are left to the few historical records and questions. That early article describes a half-buried 9-ton boulder. Kuni designed her garden around this glacial erratic, left behind 10,000 years ago when the ice retreated. It forms the backbone of her small mountain. Other boulders are not native rock and come from east of the Cascades. Basalt and volcanic rocks. Were they picked up on a return run after a strawberry shipment? Did the Mukais keep an eye out for special rocks on their delivery trips? A classic element in Kuni's garden is water. It had bubbled down the rock face of the mountain and into the ponds. The historical opinion was that these waterways were streams, and at one time, even a small canoe, a gift from tribal friends, was tied into the reeds. But Kuni had lined rocks along the edge of the ponds, which in classical design suggests boats. Did Kuni, as she left Japan, watch her home islands grow smaller as fishing boats streamed around her departing ship? Knowing that she would never return to Japan, had she created an image she could see from her window? The small boats moving over the water with the islands looming. When the Mukais created their garden, the landscape of Vashon was raw. The ancient firs, hemlocks, and cedars had been logged. The Mukai home was surrounded by open fields. And in that bare landscape, this garden would have offered an echo of the mountains and streams that surrounded Vashon. It is a feat that her garden has survived and is being revived more than 80 years after the first rocks and plants were placed.
So our effort, once we were able to identify the garden and its resources and document the garden for the preservation plan, when we had the opportunity to wonder what's the restoration of this garden to be, there was a lot of enthusiasm to accomplish everything right away. And I'm impressed that we were able to capture what were the important items. And the key was restoration of the water feature for the North Garden.
The existing water feature had a crumbling concrete structure to it, and it had piping also, but it was in really bad shape, and it was crumbled, and there was no way that we could reuse it.
That was both an effort to assess how can we retain this edge, and how can we retain the quality of the water feature and give it a functioning system. And I just came across some people who had no idea that it was rebuilt. It was completely rebuilt. But the stonework was probably our second most interest of revealing the stonework. And we have actually, as a team, between the board and ourselves, walked the entire property many times to figure out how much volunteer pruning should happen on the site at this time. And many of the trees are elderly, to put it kindly, the cherries in particular. But our focus was retain these plants, get new plants established, and then you'll be able to have a better eye for how other things are keeping up. And I'm so glad that the board chose to take that route. We do have some oversized plants, but they are original. We also have some weedy species that snuck in, and frankly, those were the plants that we worked most closely to get out of the site. When you have something that is not carefully maintained and not watered for a long period of time. It's the survivors that are there. So when you look out today, you can recognize that Japanese maple is really quite a significant survivor. Cherries as well, all of the conifers and all the evergreen shrubs. We lost a lot of the rhododendrons, a lot of the azaleas. Those were really what I would call the bloomy color was really kind of lost over the last several years. And we wanted as carefully as possible to bring back the same plants. And anyone who knows plants knows that the plants' pipes change over time. But what was helpful here was we had the original nursery catalogs from that era. And you can imagine that what's available at Malmo Nursery in South Seattle was probably what came to the garden. So we looked at original azalea and rhododendron cultivars and tried to bring those back to the garden. There's another part to this project though that's really important, which is the property is going through an evolution of purpose in use, and the setting of the building within a educational program meant that we actually had a new challenge, which was how do you link the building, the house, to the garden. And everything around the building is completely new, and all the blocks are new. And the effort to make sure that there was an accessible route to the building is all new. And so when you look at the design of the site, there was always an understanding that Cooney had a different perspective than BD, and his perspective won out on the formal front yard and the classical arrangement and formality of the plantings on the east side of the house, and her exuberance won out in the gardens. So we basically would put on our BD hat for the landscape around the building, and we would put on our Cooney hat when we went back to the gardens. So we've done a double pronged approach on the design. We are landscape architects though, so our job is to provide something that others have the excitement to carry out. And we can't believe that the board was able to construct as much and realize as much and restore as much in such a period of time.
I think overall, in retrospect, the intent that we had in the restoration process was not just to create a beautiful garden, but it was to tell a story, and it was to tell a story of what Cooney tried to create with her garden over time.
So from our perspective right now, this would be the time to look at kind of what's the next piece or the next opportunity. And the South Garden, which is kind of covered up and overgrown, and it's been abandoned at this point in time. Since it still has the bones of the garden in there, I'm hopeful that will be a consideration. Figure out how to bring that property, that part of the site back. That would provide a complete loop around the property and a real loop to the history of the site. I feel this garden has incredible potential, and even if we rebuilt the South Garden, I don't want to say it would be easy, but I think it's pretty valuable. And speaking of the garden, there are so many people in this area that have worked with Japanese gardens, and it's not a coincidence that this garden was rebuilt by Scott Arima. And he brought more than the normal contractor requirement to the reconstruction. And we would not have the beauty that we're looking at out there that's so successful without he and his team that worked much more than necessary to perform the role of the contractor to rebuild the garden. So Scott's artistry is pretty obvious at the site.
Just as during Cooney's time, when her garden was a focal point for business and social events, the restored garden has once again become a gathering place for the community. It's the only public garden on Vashon Island and is open at no charge every day of the year. In addition to offering guided tours by trained docents, interpretive signs scattered around the property illustrate the history of the Mukai family and their island home. While Cooney's garden was part of an immigrant success story, her family's experience also embodies another, more regrettable part of American history. As part of its mission, the Mukai Farm and Garden assumes a role in educating our community about the immigrant experience and the discrimination that was part of that experience. Since the house and garden were restored, we've hosted many events celebrating Japanese and Japanese American culture, including an annual Japanese-style street festival attended by over 1,800 visitors in 2019. Traditional Japanese craft workshops, films, cultural programs, children's camps, and most recently a haiku contest all bring people to the site. These events have really strengthened its role as a community space, as well as its role as an institution that's all about telling the story of the Japanese American experience. The farm and garden also has a goal of moving toward financial self-sufficiency as a public museum and educational institution. Plans are in place to make the house, garden, and nearby barreling plant available for a limited number of private events. And talks are also underway to reestablish an agricultural-based adaptive reuse of the barreling plant. Work is continuing at the site, and restoration of the barreling plant is scheduled to begin later this year. It's been a pleasure for all of us to be able to share the Mukai Garden with you, and we sincerely hope to have the opportunity to host you in person sometime in the future. We're really proud of this place.